This Choircast podcast is brought to you by my book, Unless a Seed Falls to the Ground, Welcoming the Death of the Whiteness Gospel. I wrote this story as a plea for white Christian America to enter into a season of hospice spirituality, to recover from the cancerous lie that we can start over, be in charge, and recover some original purity of Christianity. One friend calls it a love story to the church, the United States, and the entire human family. It's available now on Amazon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat. I'm with my brother John and the lovely and talented Bethany Shea, who we've just named producer, by the way.
Yeah, producer.
What an amazing title.
In an ad hoc and unilateral decision, I have just decided. Now, that means nothing. It carries no pay raise. First, actually, you know what?
What?
You know what? I take that back. I will double your current salary that we pay you.
That would be amazing. I cannot wait to see that paycheck in my mailbox.
I might even quadruple it. I mean,
wow.
The generosity is astounding.
I'll give you the same promise that the prosperity people do when you put money in the basket. I'll promise you a tenfold return on your.
Can I get a hanky with it, please?
On your love
Yes.
Only after I sweat on it.
Oh, perfect. That's what I'm looking for.
It has to carry the anointing, and it has to be apparently given out. Anyway, I'm already out to sea. We are 55 seconds in, and no one knows what the hell we're talking about. This is the podcast, by the way, that we call This Is Not Church, because if it was church, you would have left by now. And we have an awesome guest with us. We are always so blessed, man, to have amazing guests. And how many years we've been doing this, and I'm still, I never tire. I'm never not just shocked at the caliber of people that are willing to come and talk to us. So today is no exception. So let me introduce you to Aaron Robertson, and then we'll get on to our podcast. So Aaron Robertson is a writer, an editor, and a translator of Italian literature. His translation of, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name, Igiaba Scego?
That's close, yeah.
Igiaba Scego?
Scego.
Oh, that's close. Okay. That person's Igiaba Italian. I'm a Spanish speaker, not an Italian speaker. If it was Igiaba Scego, Beyond Babylon was shortlisted for the 2020 Penn Translation Prize and the National Translation Award. And in 2021, he received a National Endowment for the Arts grant. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, N+1, The Point, and Literary Hub, among other publications. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, where he moved after finishing graduate school at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. You see what I'm talking about? I say caliber, right?
Right, exactly.
Like the gravitas, the Rhodes Scholar, Oxford, Brooklyn, of all things. That's amazing. And we're here to talk about his new book called Black Utopians, Searching for Paradise and the Promised Land in America. With all that being said, welcome to the podcast. Aaron, how are you, sir?
Thank you. I am doing well. We talked beforehand a little bit, but we're on the eve of the election, so let's just have a great conversation now. And,
distract ourselves from the
maybe a different day, but
I may or may not have binge watched news all day. I am prone to do that. I did that for too many years during the Trump years and during COVID, and it became very unhealthy. I'm like, I have to
do something else. Watch something else. Watch a rom-com.
Oh, always a rom-com.
Or go take a walk, watch a really, really, like, my favorite mind-numbing but awesome, like, sitcom would, like, I'll go watch The Office. Or something like, just give me, but yeah, it's easy to get fixated, and especially when there is a lot at stake, but there's not a lot we can do at this point. So probably doesn't help to, so we'll do this instead. I think this is a good distraction. We'll talk to Aaron about his new book and maybe get him to tell us a little bit about his background. Maybe if you wouldn't mind, Aaron, just we like to kick it off sometimes just talking about people's sort of faith background, where they're coming from, that direction, and then jump into whatever.
Of course. So I'm was born and raised in Detroit, and the kind of suburbs around Detroit. I come from a really like a strongly Baptist household. Grew up going to all kinds of churches, from smaller congregations to a giant mega church like right outside of Detroit. So I've seen a mix of great intimate preachers and the kind of prosperity gospel tricksters, if that's too strong of a word. I'm sorry.
No, not strong enough. Charlatans.
Yeah, exactly. And so now I identify as agnostic, but I'm still, so much of my work and thinking is trying to understand, what my faith background meant for my life. And I think young people's relationship with the church today. So yeah, I'm really, really fascinated to talk about this more.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, that's I think a trajectory that John and I are both on for sure. Born and raised, very evangelical, very white evangelical, and then deconstructed, do our thing. And depending on the day, man, depending on the day, it's where, do I believe in God? I don't disbelieve. I'll put it that far. I'm not. I wouldn't count myself. And actually, a lot of my friends who are atheists fall more on the agnostic side too. Like, I'm not saying there's no God. I'm just saying I don't see any demonstrable proof of it. I'm going to live my life this way. But they live this life that is still very ethical. That's still very concerned with human well-being, and actually more so than a lot of professing Christians. And so I'm like, which among us is actually, because they don't necessarily feel the need for that external pressure to do that. They just do it because, well, that's just how we should treat people, and maybe we should be concerned with humanity on the whole. But yeah, it's a fascinating place to be. It is a place of, honestly, sometimes there's a lot of peace there because I don't have to know everything.
That's right. Yeah. And, I think for me, a lot of my current interest in faith traditions is really tied to community formation, right? So I mean, how do we become a part of communities? How do we remain a part of them? I think that, growing up, community was something that I really took for granted because I would go to church like all the time, Wednesdays, Sundays. Community was always there for me, and I never thought I would lose it. But as my values, shifted, a certain kind of community dropped away from me. And I think I'm sort of currently, looking to redefine what that means in my life. And so that's why I'm still kind of obsessed with religion, even though I'm not particularly religious anymore.
Have you been able to create community for yourself outside of a church setting? And what does that look like for you? How, you get to be really creative with that?
Yeah. I mean, I just a bunch of like Brooklyn artsy people is really, I think, I think, since moving to New York in 2018, I have been kind of, fixated on finding a community of artists and non-conformists and people who I guess in some way are probably moving away from something in their own childhoods, right? I mean, so many of my friends in New York moved here from somewhere else, and so I think I tend to be drawn to people who have kind of a complicated relationship, like with their homes in general. So that's the group of people that I think I've surrounded myself with in recent years. Yeah,
those are my favorite kind of people, by the way.
Yeah,
the dissidents, the nonconformists. When I moved to Texas, it was such a weird thing because it's Texas.
Yeah.
I'm from where John and Bethany are right now, which is Humboldt County. So I grew up amongst, the strange and the the tattooed and the the little town to the north of me was still a anyway, all of that stuff. Anyway, I grew up amongst those kinds of people. I grew up amongst artists and musicians, and John died in the wool, in theater and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so when I joined the military, which was a really weird thing for me to do, but I ended up in Texas now, and I have to go to Austin to find weird people. But and I do pretty regularly, but those are the kinds of people that for now, I mean, I'm with you. All I'm saying is that community there of people who've decided they're weird, you're weird, we're all weird, it's okay. And there's a lack of judgment, at least as far as that goes.
That's right.
So leads me to my question about this word utopia that you use. Talk to us about that, because obviously that's a big point of the book you've written. And it's got to be more than just, what we would conceive of it as.
Yeah, I mean, I think my fascination with the idea of utopia it probably comes from two places. So, one, I am again from Detroit, which is in many ways, I think it's been sort of narrativized as an American dystopian city, right? Like that.
Yeah.
I think in kind of national and even international discourse for so long, you say you're from Detroit and you get two responses. One, oh gosh, like what's are you okay? Like what's that
You
like?
survived.
I mean, yeah, like what's I hear there's no one living there anymore. Or the other option is I hear it's really coming back, right? And I grew up kind of moving between Detroit and the suburbs, and a part of my I think a part of the beliefs that I inherited from my family about Detroit, they were kind of ugly beliefs, right? There was a lot of internalized racism. So what I mean by that is, I came from a sort of middle class, like Black household that had these very particular ideas of, aspiration and my family sort of defined themselves against, frankly, Black Detroiters who didn't have as many resources as them, and that kind of thinking influenced my own stance towards Detroit. But when I was in high school, I dated somebody whose mom was a very prominent activist in the city, and I started to have a chance to really get to know the city like as my own, right? To kind of to embrace its people, to get to know what this place actually was. All of the narratives about ruin porn and kind of abandoned factories and homes that really overshadowed the communities that were there, the creative people who were always interested in radical creativity and making their lives better, even when local or state governments neglected them, right? There was always this kind of utopian hope that grew directly out of, I think, sort of harsh economic and social realities. So I have always been interested in the countercultural strain, I think, that that is felt among so many activists and artists in Detroit. The other side of my interest, like in Utopia, is that when I was a kid, I grew up going down south a lot to Tennessee, where my paternal grandfather is from. So he was born in this small town west of Nashville called Promised Land. And Promised Land, Tennessee, was this all-Black town that was founded in 1870, right after the Civil War. And I would go there for family reunions every year. It was kind of this escape from the city in a way. I didn't know its historic significance at the time, really. But as I got older, I began to learn that Promised Land was one of, hundreds, possibly even more than 1,000, all Black towns that existed throughout North America. And that tradition, that history is something that I wanted to understand more. Promised Land to me seemed like heaven on earth, right? And even when it was hard for me to kind of emotionally connect with the idea of heaven, of paradise, my time in Promised Land showed me that maybe there is some kind of some experience that is a little more accessible that makes me think of a kind of paradise.
One of the things I found interesting that you mentioned was the name of that was Promised Land, not the Promised Land.
Yeah, right.
And was that? I mean, in your study, was that on purpose, naming it that way?
Yeah, there are, as tends to happen with these kinds of spaces, there are are different stories about how the town, got its name. But Promised Land was like, no one exactly knows why it was Promised Land and not Promised Land. Some people still call it that. But what I like is that that Promised Land. There's something about it that feels kind of ongoing, right? Like it's not this sort of guaranteed place. It's kind of it is a site of promise, but it's something that kind of needs to always be like reinvented in some way, or fought for in some way. And I think that name it stood out to people, and so maybe that's why it's hard to say.
Yeah,
Aaron, you said that you would go there to visit your grandfather. Is that what you said?
Yeah, my my dad's side of the family. Yeah.
So it felt almost utopian for you in some way, like this idealized location coming out of Detroit. Is that right?
Yeah, it did. There was a kind of there was a quiet and calm there that I felt all the time. And I mean, a part of it also was that when I was a child, there was a period of time where my mom was she was married to a man who was abusive towards me, and so summertime was always a way to get away, right, a time to leave the chaos of my everyday life and go somewhere where I felt truly in community with so many other people. I will also say, relevant to this podcast, my abusive, former stepfather was a well-respected deacon in church, and he was so beloved by the congregation, but they didn't know that at home he would attest to these, to having these supernatural visions that revealed how evil my mother and I were. And so he would have to, I'm sorry to get dark, but like,
no, it's all right.
Is, the point of this is that from a very young age, I was attuned to, I think, a lot of the contradictions that existed within, institutional church environments. I was always kind of skeptical of, I guess, being too quick to accept things at face value. But yet, church at the time also gave me a real sense of community. Most people I found to be extremely loving. And that was also true, like when I went down south to Promised Land, like I would go to church, and that was the kind of environment that I really wanted to be in.
So within your research on what these utopian sorts of spaces look like, that place really impacted you. And then you talk about the Black Madonna as an impactful experience as well. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the book is really a kind of broad history of Black utopian ideas and spaces. And one of the main communities that I write about was associated with a church in Detroit called the Shrine of the Black Madonna. And this was it began as a kind of, like middle class church that catered to Black people on the west side of Detroit. It was founded by this pastor named Albert Clegg Jr. But in the 60s and 70s, it really becomes known as this Black nationalist church. And Reverend Clegg creates this sort of social and religious movement that he calls Black Christian nationalism. The Shrine of the Black Madonna was a really big part of the Black counterculture, of that period. And it got its name because in 1967, just a few months before the rebellion in Detroit, the church commissioned a painter named Glanton Dowdell, who was a Black nationalist from Detroit, to paint this 18-foot tall by 9-foot wide mural of a Black Madonna and child. And even now, that image, it can be pretty scandalous to people. But imagine in 1967, this is not the kind of recognizable church that is associated with the mainstream civil rights movement. This was a radical church that was attempting to show Black people, whether they were Christian or not, that the narratives that we had inherited about what Christianity was could be challenged in really creative ways. I think the kind of visual, the power of this image for so many people who saw it was that they could look at it and see themselves in this story about Christianity, about dignity too. So in writing about Black utopian thought and Black utopian experiences, I didn't only want to write about the kind of spaces that Black people have created over time, but also what the emotional and spiritual experiences were while creating these spaces too.
Yeah, it reminds me of was it Christina Cleveland, John?
Yeah.
So her book,
That's right.
And her
God
writing
is a
about
Black woman.
God is a Black woman, and her writing about her quest for the Black Madonna.
Yeah,
and we got to talk to her a little. She's a fantastic lady. But just that idea of seeing yourself, like it stunned her the first time she saw it. It was like, like this light came on. It was like, oh, okay, and I mean, scandalous maybe, but only to those who are trying desperately to co-opt something and keep it for themselves.
That's right. Yeah, and the Black Madonna too. I mean, of course, it's associated with a certain kind of Christianity, but it was this like kind of a hippie symbol too, right? Like this very like new agey symbol for a lot of people of like a kind of fertile, healthy earth, right? Like the Black Madonna was a symbol of the age of Aquarius, and so I think for a lot of the Black Christian nationalists who were part of the Shrine, she represented not only a kind of image of themselves, but she was opposed to the sort of mainstream power structures, right? So she was against the corruptions of white Christianity. She was against militarism and kind of environmental degradation. This symbol stood in for so much.
Yeah, it's amazing. It is actually, it's straight, because I remember in Christina's book, she was in Europe, right, John?
Yeah, that was in France. I believe.
In France. I don't believe those images were as scandalous.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they were just the part and had been there for a long, long time.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
Yeah, and so, but inside the reference frame of American evangelicalism, it's not just scandalous; it's borderline blasphemous.
Yeah, totally.
Which is shockingly stupid when you consider who Jesus was and where he lived and what he probably looked like. And like, come on.
Yeah. And that was that was an important part of the Shrine's reputation. Like it was not only known for the Black Madonna mural, but Reverend Clegg in 1968 published his most famous and controversial book, which was called The Black Messiah. He was really the person in the 1960s who was most associated with this idea, that Christ was a person of color, and that got him a lot of shit. Not only
so he didn't look like Kenny Loggins, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, really.
Surprise.
He didn't look like what's his name, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ian McGregor.
Exactly. I offended some good friends when I was at their house one night, and they had that really sort of iconic picture of Jesus on their wall, right. And I was like, "Man, you like Kenny Loggins too?" Man, the Footloose soundtrack is amazing, and they were like,
"I know exactly what you're talking about."
If I think about it, I'm not sure I've been invited back. That might have been it's a bridge too far. Can't joke about Jesus looking like Kenny Loggins or Ewan McGregor. Apparently,
it still sets off. It sets off a lot of nerves. Yeah.
Well, now it's a litmus test. Now I go.
Yeah.
We can't be friends if you don't think that's funny. So you have to go.
Yeah.
So you're saying because it's I mean, it is countercultural to say, even though I think historically it's true, but Clegg was one of the first to like come out openly and speak on this. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Like, not the first because there were, 19th century, Black nationalists like Henry McNeil Turner, who said, that God is a Negro, right? Like that was his sort of controversial claim. And Marcus Garvey, too, in the 1920s, he and his followers also kind of canonized this image of a Black Madonna and child. So Clegg was not the first, but he was the one to do so during this really, popular era of countercultural agitation. I think like if we think about that period as a time of utopian activity, maybe we think of the Jesus freaks, right? But we don't tend to think of a lot of like African American Jesus freaks necessarily.
Yeah, right.
Is it overshadowed at all? Do you think does it get overshadowed at all by like the other Black nationalist movements, like maybe like the Nation of Islam or some other like Malcolm X type figures that maybe? I mean, we love to co-op. Don't get me wrong, we love to co-op MLK. I mean, white people love to cherry pick MLK quotes. Man, we're good at that. We ignore a lot of the really radical stuff, but we maybe don't realize that those two movements existed side by side in many ways and worked hand in glove, right?
That's right. Yeah, and the shrine in Detroit is on this street. It's called Linwood Street, and Linwood Street, in the late 1950s and 1960s was, like I would say, one of the most radical religious streets in the country, because not only was the shrine of the Black Madonna established there, but just about a mile away, there was Temple Number 1 of the Nation of Islam. And so these people were always in conversation with each other. People actually mistook the Black Christian nationalists for being Black Muslims, for being followers of Elijah Muhammad, because a lot of what they were saying, was very similar. And I think the Black Christian nationalists were inspired by the kind of, the nation building ethos of the Nation of Islam.
Can you explain the difference between Christian nationalism that's a hot button ticket today compared to Black nationalists and what you're describing?
Yeah, totally. So, it's funny because this book began as an essay that I started to write in 2019. And so I was reading about Black Christian nationalism and thought it was fascinating. And I knew that white Christian nationalism was, a term that mostly I think academics used. But then January 6th happens and I'm like, oh man, now I'm going to need to explain that Black Christian nationalism is not just the Black version of white Christian nationalism. So I think at its simplest, I would say that Black Christian nationalism, as Clegg conceived of it, was really concerned with ensuring the material and, psychological well-being of Black people. That was its primary aim. And it was not built on, as white Christian nationalism is, this explicit intention, not only to exclude other people, but also to systematically disenfranchise them, to systematically dehumanize other people who are not, white, heteronormative Christians. I think that the Black Christian nationalists were not well understood at the time, and many people, Black and white, dismissed the Shrine of the Black Madonna as a kind of cult. It was not that, but because its theological beliefs were so uncommon and radical at the time, like it was easy to dismiss what was not, easily understood as being cultish, right? But that wasn't the case. And so I think Clegg was interested in taking the ways that Black people had been institutionally, separated from other people. And what he said was, okay, well, if white society is telling us that they would like us to be, separate, then we will use that kind of, separatism to our advantage. We will create, educational and social and economic institutions that are meant to benefit us. That is a very different mission than what white Christian nationalists concern themselves with.
So then I'm kind of curious as well. That was a really helpful explanation. You mentioned earlier in the podcast that you grew up in a state where there was like a lot of internalized racism within your family. In your research on Black nationalism, Christian nationalism in that way, were you able to come to see that more in yourself? And then if so, how has that like influenced the way that you interact with your family? Have they received any of that from you as well?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. Thank you. Because I think in part, one of the kind of fascinations with utopian communities and spaces, it like usually starts when there is something that an observer wants, right? Like I saw the Black Christian nationalist movement and what it represented, and realized that, like in my own childhood, that was so not like what I grew up with. Like I did not grow up in a family, of Black nationalists. It was like very different kinds of churches. And so I think in researching for the book, and also in talking to so many of the people who were a part of the shrine, for me, it was kind of liberating, because I realized that there were so many other ways to, I think, be in community with others, to still be attached to a sense of spirituality that looked very different from the kinds of the kinds of spaces like that I grew up in. And I did tell my family about the book I was working on, like that it was about the Black Christian nationalists. And I think at first my grandparents were a little bit skeptical because they also thought it was like a part of the Nation of Islam. But the more I talked about it, the more they kind of realized that this was something that was helping me. And I think that was a really beautiful process to go through,
One of the things you mentioned, I believe, and I don't want it to come across as negative, because I don't think it's a negative connection, but there was a connection to like socialism, communism. And I think in a lot of ways, socialism it has a lot of beautiful connections to what these radical groups are trying to do. But did you see a lot of like negativity and negative connotations with socialism and communism connected to the church?
And that's interesting, because I think that, for many people, like in the church, they did not explicitly identify, as kind of like biblical communists, right? Or,
right.
or like, certainly not Marxist. Clegg himself said like we are not revolutionary Marxists here, like in this church. But I do think that like if you look up, definitions of what Christian socialism like meant and stood for, that really is what the church was doing. And, one example of that is that, they, beginning like in the 1970s, the church established multiple communes throughout the country. And in these communes, there were a small number of church members who left their, full-time, what they called slave jobs, like in the real world, to devote themselves, full-time to raising money for the church. And so they lived on a communal budget, and the idea was that like you did not need much to sustain yourself. You could all live in common, right? And the point of sort of sharing resources was explicitly to kind of distance themselves from praising, capitalist greed and like constant accumulation, like for its own sake. I think it's important to know that, Albert Clegg, a part of the reason why he started the Shrine of the Black Madonna is because he grew up knowing these prosperity, like gospel, preachers and prophets. Sweet Daddy Grace had a church just down the road from the Shrine, like in the late 1950s. Like there was also Prophet Jones, right? These like well-known like Black preacher swindlers. So he was upset with these religious leaders on the one hand, but he was also equally kind of frustrated with like Detroit's, upwardly mobile black middle class, because he felt that they were too concerned with themselves and not paying enough attention to the kind of material conditions of poor Black people in Detroit. So his church was in a sense, a poor people's church. And I think in that way, his mission aligned well with what we might call, Christian socialism.
I feel like anytime there is any kind of social work, it automatically becomes, you're socialist, right?
Right.
That's the bugaboo of white nationalists. Is that's the boogeyman you can throw out there, or socialists. What are they doing to Kamala Harris right now? They can't think of they really can't think of anything to legitimately critique her on. So she's a Marxist because her dad was a Marxist. Oh my God, and she's a Marxist and she's dumb. Oh, that's okay. JD Vance today called her trash. That's because that's
classy.
That's highfalutin political talk right there.
Yeah, exactly.
But that is the bugaboo. What I was reading lately, where some pastors have been saying to themselves lately that like they almost can't preach the Sermon on the Mount in their church anymore because people are either biblically illiterate, so they think and they get critiqued for for preaching wokeness. I hate that fucking word. I really do. It's just so dismissive and dumb.
Yeah.
And then when they say, well, those are Jesus's words, I understand there's a history with certain types of socialism, looks like anything else that is negative. And when you mix that with totalitarianism and authoritarianism, you get bad things. But that being said, the Jesus theology, the Jesus ideology is socialist. I mean, the early church was living in common. Paul told them we hold all these things in common and we share with what we have. And
that's right. Yeah. This was, and I mean, there was a group in the Shrine of church leaders called the Essenes, and
absolutely.
These were right. One of the kind of earliest examples.
John the Baptist was an Essene, wasn't he? So one of those,
that's right.
Like very little material possession.
That's right.
Like very, very strict in their adherence to certain things. And well, in white Christian world, we'd call that a monastery. And we'd praise them for their devotion to God.
Yeah.
Everybody else were like bunch of radicals living together. It's like,
There was some, like I was, I think, digging around in the archives once, and there was a line about how the Shrines commune in Detroit was envisioned as a kind of monastery in the ghetto, which I really loved, right? Like, I mean, it was not, the point of this community was not to be like distant from the world, like as it was. The point was to kind of plant themselves right in the middle of it, but to, separate themselves from a lot of the mainstream values that they were trying to challenge.
Well, honestly, when you think about it, what a beautiful way to do that. Let's demonstrate a completely alternative way to live in the midst of what everyone else is doing, and just put that on display.
Exactly.
I like that. Monasteries, you're right. You're right. I mean, most people, those are far off places where people go to retreat and they separate themselves from the world. But I like that idea of a monastery in the ghetto, someplace in smack dab in the middle of life, where you can go, oh, that's another way to do this. And we don't all have to, because that eschewing of all of that, because you're right, so much of Western civilization, so much of which is now become Western Christianity is consumerist, and, it's all about accumulation. It's all about wealth. There was I don't know if he was well known. He was well known to us, Detroit preacher that used to come to Texas all the time, and his name was Jack Wallace. He had a church called the Redeemer or something like that. He passed away in 2005, but he would come to us, and he was a very, very, very heavy prosperity gospel guy, white guy, but pastored a largely black church. But 90% of his sermon was telling us how well he was doing. And it was, talking about how many houses he owned and how many motorcycles and how many, it was just, but it was all predicated on, because he was faithful to God, God had given him all these things in the midst of and he was smack dab in Detroit somewhere. But I like that pushback of, now there's a way to do this that's more authentic.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's more faithful to the words of Jesus. So, and if that's utopian, then go. Does that take on for you? Let me ask you this: does that word utopia take on a bit of a almost a sort of wishful thinking, or are we talking practically? I mean, there's a version of utopia that's obviously got like Greek mythology, where like this is this place of perfection.
Of course, yeah.
But is this a version that's like, no, I'm not really talking about that so much as I'm talking about creating this space that is something else.
Yeah, totally. I wanted to write something that challenged what we tend to think of as utopia, or like even the way we value like what that word means, right? I mean, when you hear utopian, it tends to have a negative connotation. It tends to connote something that is impractical and not a part of the world as it actually is. Like if the book has an argument, I think it's that like Black utopianism is really about not only the creative ways that Black communities have responded to all kinds of disenfranchisement and dehumanization, but also the very pragmatic steps that they have taken to respond to all of these obstacles. So, like on the one hand, I am writing about, these groups that they looked to the Israeli kibbutzim, as models, or, Cuban liberation schools, or like even, Soviet Union kindergartens. But that was not for its own sake, right? Like, why do you look for a different educational model? Well, maybe it's because in Detroit, schools were underfunded, and there were too many students in classrooms, and they weren't getting the money that they needed from local or state governments, right? So we need to look elsewhere, like in the world, see what is happening now, and maybe take from those models, because nothing else seems to be working. That's the same kind of ethos that led to the creation of freedom schools, right, and kind of Afrocentric institutions. They were not created for their own sake. They were responding to something very specific in the real world.
Right. Well, you talk a little bit about how the educational system works, where in primarily Black schools, they would get like the secondhand books, the books of the white schools. When they got new books, then they get the older books, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, of course, obviously redlining had a direct connection to how much money was funded to schools, right?
Yeah, right. And like the book is not only about the Shrine of the Black Madonna, it's about other groups too. But I think the Shrine is useful because, like even when they established these sort of all Black communes, why were they doing that? Well, because, there were debates about, open housing at the time. So where were Black people allowed to live, in cities? So often white neighborhoods did their damn best to show Black people that they did not want them there, And so as a result, maybe you have to live, together, right? Like you have to live in the same areas, right? You have to be able to kind of organize against these kinds of things. So everything had a purpose.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting that, like in New York, where you have specific communities, right? You have Italian communities, you have Jewish communities, and no one speaks out about these communities. That isn't anything abnormal. But when the Black community tries to create a Black community, that is them
menace. Yeah.
But then it becomes a menace. It becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, it's a great question. I think in part, there's something about the surveillance, I think, or monitoring of Black communities that, right? Like if you don't know exactly what's going on, if certain white leaders don't know exactly what is happening in Black communities, that's a dangerous thing, right? So if Black communities are congregating, like whether that is in a neighborhood or whether that's in schools or the basement of churches, right? These are too often seen as inherently dangerous, subversive places, right? And so it is one of the reasons why, separatist experiments were so widely condemned by a lot of the mainstream, I think. It wasn't because the critics of these movements wanted their neighbors to be Black people. It was because they saw these movements as a threat against their own power, Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how, you're talking about this shrine and how it's in the middle of some difficult spaces in Detroit. And it reminds me of, there's this water feature in the desert called Engedi that people in Israel would go to and find in the middle of dry and thirsty lands. And scripture talks about it a little bit. And, Black spaces are almost like an Engedi for people that are overlooked or just even harassed. And I'm curious if you've found an Engedi or a shrine like this in Brooklyn. Have you found a place where you feel safe and where you can be fully yourself without any pretense?
Oh, what an amazing image that I will be using now. And I will credit it to you. That's really great. There are a lot of spaces like that in Brooklyn. Yeah. There's this one sort of Afrofuturist group here called Intelligent Mischief, and they have their kind of actual HQ is in Bushwick somewhere. But this is a group that mostly lives online, and so kind of Afrofuturist artists and activists and educators are kind of constantly in communication with each other through this group. There's also just down the street from me, where I'll be doing an event next month, is this place called the Weeksville Heritage Center. And Weeksville was one of the first all Black kind of communities in Brooklyn. And so this is a center built on the site where this community was. So yeah, spaces like this are all around New York. And so it's great to be able to find that here.
Yeah, I do love New York. That's one of the things I love about it. If you want to find something, you'll find your people there somewhere.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Let's let's talk about creativity then, and the role that creativity plays in all of this, because there was a mention anyway of things like art in prisons and art and things like I know we could talk for a very long time about policing and the way that the criminal justice system is stacked up against people of color and leveraged against them. But the flip side of that is there's a role that creativity plays in all of that, and kind of dovetails with a conversation John and I had with, and we've had too many, so I forget. But do you remember having the person, John, who came and talked to us about going into the prisons and teaching art? And yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I can't remember that, but there was that anyway inside of a very, very obviously dire and sometimes colorless world, you know. But I was curious about that.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I wanted, one of the main characters in the book, was Glanton Dowdell, that the man who painted the Black Madonna mural. But I also explore, even before he painted that mural, he had spent more than a decade in prison, and he had been in a visual artist since childhood. Actually, like he had always drawn, but it was in prison when he really began to refine his art. He actually taught other inmates how to paint, and there was one story of him like he could teach people anywhere, right? So they would go out into the prison yard, and he would pick up a stone and turn to the inmates and say, like, you don't need a canvas. Like, you can just take this stone and paint something on it, right? And that, I think, is like that ethos, one, is just incredible, but it's also like something I wanted to write about, right? Like, you can be creative, like even in the most, sort of dire circumstances. And the fact that that he was a prison artist, I think it is a very meaningful thing to talk about in the story. These spaces that are meant to, exclusively dehumanize people, can also generate a spirit of rebellion, resilience, and creativity. And that's not to, it's not to romanticize that, but it is to say that, like, despite all of these horrible things that happened, not only to Glanton, but to so many people like him, there was still room for innovation and artistry. And that's a big part of the story I'm telling.
I found it interesting that you, I think at one point you say that his biography was somewhat, I don't want to say made up, that's not the right word, embellished maybe.
Yeah.
So was it difficult? Was it difficult to kind of weed out truths, or did you just kind of go with what was available to you?
It was like, he was funny because so Glanton wrote a memoir of his childhood in Detroit, and it's this beautiful kind of like, picaresque account of this mischievous kid who's getting into all kinds of trouble and involved in crimes that he's not sure like how he got involved in them, but and he lived an incredible life, because soon after he painted the mural, he got, he was a Black nationalist, he was a Black Panther, he got involved with some problematic groups in Detroit, and eventually, found himself running from the law. And so he actually self-exiled to Sweden, where he lived for the rest of his life until he died in 2000. And so I actually spoke to his daughters and his ex-wife, who lived in Sweden with him, and they didn't they loved him, but they didn't even, fully know the man, because he was a bit of a loner. He would often escape like into the Scandinavian mountains to hike and, be on his own. So his story was interesting, less because of the truths he told about himself, but more because this was a man who was trying to kind of carve space for himself, right? And that meant not fully revealing himself. And that I think was kind of a beautiful thing to try to capture.
Yeah. No, Aaron, this has been so fascinating. The journey that you've been on and the ways that you have included your own story into this greater story, and just like your perspective on it all is beautiful. That what you offer, just anybody who reads this book, is really an incredible outlook on what it means to be human in a community that oftentimes gets relegated to the side. And I don't know, it's just very life-giving. I feel like I want to look at art differently even, and how much freedom and I don't know, just I guess relief is the word I keep thinking of when it comes to art. All their emotions are placed into their art. And I know that you are an artist just because you're a writer. Do you have any other mediums that you find yourself leaning towards, especially in spaces of need or joy or concerns or anything like that?
Oh gosh, not as a practitioner, unfortunately. I have these really weird long fingers, and people say you should have played the piano or something. And I'm like, unfortunately, I don't. But I come from a family of musicians, so I do think that growing up, even as complicated as my relationship could sometimes be to a very loving, but, kind of ideologically rigid, I think, family in some ways. They were all artists. And I think that, and I'm sure in some subconscious way that opened up a really, necessary space for me. I don't know how exactly, but I'm sure it did.
Well, I mean, even just I shouldn't say just, writing is its own form of art.
Oh, yeah.
And there is, you are a beautiful writer. And, I don't know what it looks like for you to keep pressing into those spaces, but it's obvious that it is something that's wanting to come out of you in a way, just from the thing that you just said, that even noticing your hands and, being able to see other people's potential in themselves. It seems like you have a lot of potential in yourself as well. And so it's never too late to learn how to play the piano, and it's never too late to pick up a paintbrush or to turn your writing into poetry or whatever it is to benefit not just yourself, but those around you as well. So I encourage you into that.
Thank you so much. And, I really, I think especially tomorrow, I'm going to carry that beautiful thought with me. That even in, really. And that I think is, not to wrap it up too cleanly, but that is in part what I wanted to get across with this book. It does end by talking about these kind of differences between the visions espoused by white Christian nationalists and those espoused in, I'm in the Shrine. And it does end with a little conversation about, once Biden was inaugurated at the beginning of 2021, he got an inauguration day painting by Dr. Jill Biden and Senator Roy Blunt. And it was a painting by this Black artist, in the 19th century, named, I believe, Robert Duncanson. And it was this beautiful, pastoral, with two people walking, a giant, rainbow. It was so, it looked like paradise. And he had painted it right around the time of the Civil War. And I think there was something about that just, it felt like it captured the just emotional moment that we're still living in. Regardless of what happens tomorrow, in the days after, there will always be people who paint these pictures of people strolling beneath a rainbow. And it's a necessary contrast, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and it's a necessary place of hope that ultimately, hopefully, we all know that, again, regardless of the outcome, we're all still here, and then the work continues. And we, regardless of who's occupying the White House, that doesn't mean if Kamala wins, the work continues because nothing's going to get easier.
That's right.
So, I mean, it on one hand, it's very, very, it's very important. On the other hand, it doesn't change much. We still have to have, feet to the wheel and whatever the hell metaphor I'm trying to come up with. You understand what I'm saying? There's no panacea. It doesn't suddenly all get fixed just because we elect the right person. But anyway, in the meantime, I think we can all collectively wring our hands and hold our breath and hope for the best. And at the very least, maybe let one little sliver of ugly American history, maybe mercifully, go behind us. And tackle the next one that comes, because there's another one coming. But I tell you what, your book is so appropriately timed. I think it's come out at exactly the right time, and I think it's going to be. I hope it's well received. We've enjoyed having you. The book again, Black Utopians: Searching for Paradise in the Promised Land in America. Aaron Robertson. You guys, I know you've stuck around the song because it's fascinating. So I know you're still here. Go get a copy. Go buy 3 or 4. Have a book study. Take it to your church group. Leave it on the desk of someone you love or hate. But man, thank you so much for taking the time and hanging with us.
Absolutely.
Thank
you.
It's
been an honor.
This was great. This was awesome.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.